So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Sid Yang. Sid is senior donor advisor rather for the Movement Voter Project. She's going to talk to us today about how to connect with donors and secure funding for progressive initiatives. And so we know that there's a lot of activists certainly on the Zoom today, but there's also organizational leaders or future budding organizational leaders. So we felt that we really wanted to lift this important topic up. This election cycle, the Movement Voter Project guided over 31,000 donors to support 636 local organizations in 42 states. Over the years, Sid has worked extensively with young women, queer folk, and emerging artists as a counselor, a coach, and a philanthropic advisor to families, young inheritors, working to align their resources and power with social justice values. Sid, thank you so much for being on today and for your generous support to AAPI Progressive Action.
Varun, thank you for inviting me. And it's great to see you, and it's great to be here today. I am really, really excited to share with you some of the learnings that we received as a part of Movement Voter Project and you know, organizing 31,000 donors. And I would also add that in this cycle of 2019 and 2020, we ended up raising and moving over $100 million to grassroots organizations doing electoral organizing around the country, including many AAPI groups as well. And so that's huge, right? So when we think about that number, I even say that, and it's also like, whoa, like it boggles my mind that we raised and moved over $100 million because it just seems unreal, but it's possible, right? And it was a drop in the bucket of what is spent around political dollars. And yet we see impact, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about in this crash course, right, on fundraising and working with donors, to talk a little bit about what did we learn? What are some of the strategies that we employ at Movement Voter Project? What are some of the tips or techniques that make donor advising or working with donors much more enjoyable than like an onerous task of having to ask for money? And most of my specific experience, I have worked with foundations, but what I'm going to speak to mostly today is working with individual donors and working with like groups of donors, right? So institutional fundraising is not necessarily going to be the topic today. So when we think about fundraising, everyone will tell you, well, it's about relationships, right? Which sometimes can be like, oh, that makes so much sense. And other times it can be really frustrating of like, oh God, like that takes so much time. Or like, how do you build new relationships? And in a pandemic and in all of these times, right? But if we think about relationship building in terms of our fundraising, in terms of our resource growing as organizing, right? We know how to be organizers. That's a given. And so how do we translate organizing practices, organizing tactics, organizing skill sets to fundraising? And that's where it becomes really effective in how we grow funds and also grow those relationships and deepen them. And that's what we do at Movement Voter Project is we approach our fundraising as a form of organizing. So we're donor organizing. And so that may be a term that you've heard before and it may be new. But it is a form of relationship building. And so when we think about relationships for fundraising, we think about relationships with donors, right? Which I'm going to speak to, relationships with institutional funders or foundations, and then also our relationships with other organizations, other entities in our ecosystem of who we're organizing with, because all of those are the relationships that build the connections that we need in order to raise the funds, but also to survive and thrive as entities, as organizers. So as individuals, as collectives, and as movements. And so if we think about fundraising or resource building as a form of or practice of connection, how can that shape or frame how you're approaching that the donor work or that relationship building work? And we know that from a systemic lens, connection is what builds stronger communities, builds stronger relationships. Disconnection is what allows for forms of oppression to show up. right? And so what we're doing is a healing practice, right? It's reweaving connection in our relationships, in our communities, and that's what's going to build us stronger organizations and stronger entities for the long haul. And I really appreciate, David Lee, what you were saying earlier of that this is the messaging, that this is not just for this moment, right, or this election cycle, but we're really thinking long-term. And that's a big part of how we build those relationships, is thinking out what are the next 3 cycles, right? What are the next 10 cycles, right? Who are we building as a team in terms of our donors, in terms of our members to do that? So one of the things I wanted to share with you today is what are the donor motivations that showed up? And I think it's really important to share this because oftentimes we think of donors as this monolithic entity of like people with money. But actually how money moves is driven by individual motivations and individual desire. So these are, I'm going to give you a list of some of the motivations that showed up in this last election cycle, because I think it's indicative of where we were in 2020, but it also is very much going to be true as we move into the subsequent years of this new administration. So primary motivation, people wanted to win, right? People want to win local races. They want to win national races. They want to get Trump out of office. Sometimes people are like, I don't care about anything else. I just want Trump out of office, right? Another motivation is people really want to see themselves as a good ally, and a good ally to swing states, right? If they're not living in a swing state, or a good ally to other communities or organizations that they believe are doing good work, and wanting to see themselves as they're progressive, right? This is who I am. I give this money. Therefore, I am progressive. I'm on the right side, right? So there's also that. There's also donors who really want to and are driven by wanting to share power and share resources and redistribute power and redistribute resources. And that includes the redistribution of wealth, right? So people who are driven by that, as well as reparations and a lot of more kind of disrupting historic models of wealth accumulation, right? Other motivations are a strong desire to follow the leadership of BIPOC leaders and BIPOC organizations around the country. Another one is long-term vision of collective and social justice, of liberation, seeing their role as somebody who can move resources as being a part of a much larger, more collective vision of movement visions, right? And then another one, and this one is pretty much like spread out across the board with donors, is people give from an emotional place, right? So what are the emotions that drive or motivate donors, right? So this is important to notice. So, and being really transparent, one of the things I hit up against a lot, because I will say the majority, high majority of that 31,000 donors are white folks, right? And so what are the motivations? One of those motivations is white guilt. And that is something that does come up as we're doing donor work and donor advising work. And so it's something that we encounter, especially as folks of color, and it's real. So that people give from there. People give from a place of feeling or sensing solidarity. They give from a place of fear. They move money from a place of hope, as well as seeking or sensing a sense of belonging. So all of these are really important motivations. And there's probably more that you will encounter and have encountered, but I just wanted to name some of the big ones. And all of this influences how we message or how we're building relationships with the donors. So it's nothing is ever a one size fits all when we're doing donor work. It's really looking at the relationship building of like, how are we getting to know people as individuals? What drives them, what connects them? And then how do we build those relationships around that, right? So what we learned, right? These are a couple of learnings as a political funder, is that in 2020, and because of this election cycle and the chaos that was this year, is that more people and more individual donors are much more comfortable now in moving C4 or PAC dollars than they were in 2018. And this is really important, I think, to the work that you all are doing, but the work that the movement is doing is because we're seeing donors who are less likely to restrict their funding to C3 dollars, right? And that gives organizers much more freedom to do the work that they're doing and do the work that we're doing. So I think that's a wonderful trend, and we're really pushing that. Donors this is another learning, donors like to be a part of something larger than themselves, right? So something that feels effective and something that feels generative. So creating spaces for connection and community building were really important in how we raised $100 million, but how we connected with 31,000 donors, right? We don't have one-on-one relationships with all 31,000 donors, but there were points of entry where those 31,000 donors were able to feel like they belonged and they were connected and they were a part of something much larger. So we did a lot of online virtual house parties, lots of different events, spaces where people were invited in and felt that sense of belonging, right? That sense, and then could tap into that sense of hope. And I know we're not the only group that does that. Many groups do that. I know Seed the Vote does that, a number of different groups. And so like, how can you do something like that that doesn't, disrupt you from your work or distract completely, but also creates a sense of belonging for the donors and the relationships that you're building. The other thing we learned is that this political moment that we're in, and I don't mean just 2020, I mean kind of like this moment broadly, around racial justice, around, the fight for democracy, all of these pieces, has been very activating for individuals. And so a lot of that 31,000 donors, many of them had never given politically before, or hadn't given political dollars before, right? So they'd given to, mostly C3 traditional charity giving. And because of this moment, folks were willing to expand out how they're giving. And so what that means is we now have a field of donors who are much more interested in taking risks with their giving, but also trying new things and being experimental with the relationships that they're building through their gifts. And that we're seeing this is where people are at. And that's where we're kind of building those relationships and trying to deepen and do more advocacy work, and do more of that relationship building as well. And at Movement Voter Project, I would say one of the things that we see is that, yes, we're raising this money to move to movement organizations. And at the same time, part of my job is very much about educating and doing the work with donors and advising them so that when they come in and do work directly with you and directly with the organizations, they're at a place where they're not going to be problematic. That's our hope. That's our hope. But really doing this work that we're building and organizing donors for long-term sustainability of all of our movements, not just for this political moment. Okay, so that said, I wanted to share one last thing, and this is based on some of the questions, Varun, you had sent me ahead of time. And the question was, what are some common mistakes that maybe younger or newer groups maybe make around fundraising or doing donor organizing work? And what is some advice to groups that I might offer? So other than what I shared, the one thing that I would say is tell stories. Stories are, we know this, right? In organizing, stories are powerful. It's what builds connection. It's that piece going back to what keeps us connected and feeling interconnected with each other and what's happening outside of our own little selves and bubbles, but tell stories. And one of the things I would say in addition to that is that there's a tendency, and we've been trained within the nonprofit structure and how we work and do site visits with foundations, like have created this dynamic of us versus them, or we have to prove ourselves to foundations. And yes, that system exists, right? The way that traditional foundation and institutional philanthropy is set up is very much creates that dynamic. But one of the ways to disrupt that, and one of the ways to build those relationships in a deeper way, is to treat each other like comrades. We're in this organizing work together, we're in the movement together. And so to think about when you're telling those stories, to think about how would you tell your friend that story? How would you tell somebody who you're in the struggle with that story, as opposed to sitting back and I'm talking at somebody or a donor with the story? Ask the donor questions, right? Engage them in a similar conversation, right? The more we learn about each other as individuals, that's where that connection happens, and that's where the organizing happens, right? And that's where we're building a base, because the base is not just of our members, but also of our donors and also of those who are showing up with variety of different kinds of resources. And so if we can think about how we're talking to donors and how we're telling our stories as a form of organizing, you're going to be much more effective. And it may take a little longer to raise the money, but you have people in your, like, yeah, in the family for the longer haul. And that's what we all need, because this is not a fight that ends now. Just because Biden is in office and Kamala is in office doesn't mean that everything's good, right? We're looking at this, it's the long run, it's the long game, right? And how do we keep donors in it with us for the long game as well, is really, really important. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So enlightening. There's so few folks like yourself, frankly, who are people of color in the donor advising world. And so it's frankly, it's really difficult at times to just hear these honest and authentic insights. So really appreciate you joining today. Thank you so much for your support, to our organization, to the countless others across the country. You made a difference. Your organization made a difference, and we're really appreciative of that. Thank you so much.